This is an Irish independent podcast.
Today on the podcast, we're going to talk to Bill Morris in Detroit about the city of Detroit and about the Detroit Lions. They play the Washington Commanders this weekend in the divisional round. That's the quarterfinal for those of you not aficionados of the NFL. Right now, the Detroit Lions are the favourites to win the Super Bowl on February 9th. They have never won the Super Bowl. They have never even reached the Super Bowl. What's interesting about city and team is the extent to which their fortunes have run in parallel. You could start anywhere, but the 1950s is where we should go. For the Detroit Lions, these were the halcyon days. In 1954, the Lions were top of the tree, going for a third NFL in a row.
Hello, football fans. This is Van Patrick inviting you to go back through the 1954 football season with the Detroit Lions. We'll review 7 of the most exciting, most dramatic games as the Lions swept to their third consecutive Western Division championship.
The world champion Detroit Lions begin the defense of their National Football League crown at Briggs Stadium before a hometown crowd that numbers in excess of 57,000 fans. Affording the opposition for the Motor City 11 will be the Chicago Bears. The champion Lions aren't used to such treatment. On the following kickoff, they show that they too mean business. Bill Bowman takes the ball on the goal line, escorted by a pack of Lions. Bowman tears through the Bears on a 100-yard counting canter.
Meanwhile, the city itself was thriving. In the 1950s, the car industry was to the fore. Detroit's big 3 car companies supplied 94% of the US motor market. That's a lot of cars. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, 94% of every car in America. Detroit itself was the 4th largest city in America. It was the birthplace of Motown in the late 1950s. The Kronk Gym had been on the go since the 20s, where Emanuel Stewart would forge world champions like Thomas the Hitman Hearns, Lennox Lewis, Vladimir Klitschko, and of course, Andy Lee. But from the 60s on, for both team and city, things went into decline. Much like bankruptcy, it was slow at first and then all of a sudden. For instance, the oil crisis in the 70s led people to buy more fuel-efficient cars from abroad. It was the beginnings of a chip at Detroit dominance. Population started to decline. There was white flight and urban decay. And then on the pitch, things were not good for the Lions. There were a few playoffs in the 80s, but very little to get excited about. The last 15 years have marked an nadir for city and team. There was 2008, of course, the financial crisis, which obliterated the last of the automotive industry there. Mitt Romney suggested letting the city go bankrupt. President Barack Obama rallied to its defense.
Could have just kicked the problem down the road and let these companies fail. And you will recall there were some politicians who said we should do that. Some even said we should let Detroit go bankrupt. You remember that? Think about what that choice would have meant for this country if we had turned our backs on you.
Interestingly, that same year, 2008, the Lions have their worst ever season. They played 16 games, they lost 16 games. City and team at the bottom. But things get worse again for Detroit. The city does go bankrupt. In 2014, it became the biggest city in American history to declare bankruptcy. It simply couldn't pay its bills. There was talk of selling city-owned art to try and stem the tide. In the end, bankruptcy was the only option. With a 75% black population, Detroit became a symbol for minorities who argued they were forgotten. Many Lions fans lived 50 minutes down the road in Flint, Michigan, which of course brings us to the Flint water scandal in the 2010s. With money tight, the city switched water suppliers. They start taking it from the Flint River, but the water is untreated. It corrodes the pipes, which in turn means lead enters the drinking water in Michigan. Lead is not something that should be anywhere near drinking water. There were charges of a cover-up. Officials said filtered water was safe. The public was sceptical. They refused to drink it, refused to bathe their children in it, and the city started handing out free bottles of water. And then they stopped. Famously, in 2016, President Barack Obama, speaking in Michigan, took the least committed, smallest sip of water ever committed to camera.
I really did need a glass of water. This is not a stunt.
Here's Larry Marshall, a Michigan resident, speaking in 2020 while waiting 5 hours for bottled water.
Water should be a basic necessity that we shouldn't have to wait or stand in line for. You know, this is not a third world country, but we're living like one.
Thankfully, things have improved, or certainly they're starting to improve in Detroit. It's on the rebound is the word. It's a complicated city and things are not perfect, but investment is up, property prices are going up dramatically, and for the first time in a long time in Detroit, there is optimism. And connected or no, the same can now be said of their team. Last season, they reached the NFC Championship game, in the effect, the last four. It was their best season in Super Bowl history, by a distance. Even one of Detroit's most famous sons was on board.
For far too long, Detroit has been on the receiving end of losing seasons and bad punchlines. You try to shut out the noise, but after a while, that starts to live in your head.
0-16, the worst team in league history.
That means that when a dude like this comes to town, the conversation changes. We finally had a reason to feel good about where this team was headed.
Told you guys we're built for this. We can overcome anything.
Made us all realize that maybe history wasn't repeating itself. It's all come down to this. For a city, its team, and their fans who've been waiting for this night for 30 years. Detroit don't get a whole lot of Hollywood endings, but tonight, we have a shot. And when we get our shot, well, you know what comes after that.
And that was last year. This year, the Lions stand on the precipice of history. This is their best ever chance of Super Bowl glory. Bill Morris is the author of The Lions Finally Roar, The Ford Family, The Detroit Lions, and The Road to Redemption in the NFL. It was published last year. Bill, this is a city and team that has had its struggles, so I take it things are happy at the moment.
Hey, listen, I got an email from an old buddy of mine who's born and raised in Detroit, worked for the Free Press, the morning paper, for 30-some years. How about if I read this to you? It's just a couple of sentences. This will tell you, I'm not making this up. And this is a guy who's a decorated reporter. He's lived there all his life. And here's what he says. It's not only fun to cheer for the Lions, but to watch the absolute mania that has descended upon Detroit, especially as someone who covered the Tigers, Pistons, and Red Wings at the peak of their games, both as a sports writer and news reporter. The Lions really take the cake on widespread craziness. That's from a native, longtime, lifelong Detroiter and a veteran journalist. So it's not a fantasy. The city is on its head right now. It's really amazing.
Can you tell us a bit about that, about the mania?
Sure. I was there for the opening game this year against the LA Rams. They played Matthew Stafford, their former quarterback, in the season opener. And I was also there in April for the NFL draft. I don't know if you guys covered that, but that was 3 days of absolute insanity. 700,000 people descended on Detroit from all over the world for the draft. And then the opening game of the season was a madhouse. The whole downtown was rocking. Everybody in the city, you go to auto parts stores, bars, gas stations, everybody's talking about this football team. And, you know, not to put too much on it, but there's something parallel. I think they're on a track, the way the team has rebounded and the city seems to be rebounding right now. They're in tandem. They're on a parallel rails right now. And it's happened before, up and down over the decades in my lifetime. But right now, it's really, like my friend says, it takes the cake for craziness right now.
Let's start with the team for a moment. In the Super Bowl era, they've never reached the Super Bowl. Last year, about as close as they've come. Dan Campbell is worth a mention. He took over as head coach in 2021. Interestingly, he was a player for the Lions in that 0 wins from 16 team in 2008 at the height of the financial crisis, dubbed the worst team in the NFL at the time. So former player arrives as head coach in 2021 and now all this improvement. So I guess it's pretty fair to put a lot of it at his door.
I think so, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. That was his last season as a player. He went to the Super Bowl early in his career, I believe, with the New York Giants. And I didn't realize it at the time, but when he did that famous press conference when they introduced him in Detroit as the new head coach, and he was talking all that craziness about we're going to bite off kneecaps when they kick us in the teeth and all that. I didn't realize at the time that he was indeed on that 0-16 team. That was his last year as a player. So he wasn't just talking, he had lived it. He knew what Detroit players and fans had been through. And I think a big part of what's going on right now is that these young players respect him for having been through these flames. And, they know that he's the real deal. He's not just talking like a lot of these coaches do. He lived it. He knows what it's like to lose and to really, really, really suffer as a player. And he's turned that into a positive with these guys because these young guys are completely bought into what he's preaching. And I think that's the key to the success that they're having right now, or one of the keys. There are several, but that's a big one, yeah.
Yeah, they've a kind of a swashbuckling style. He's very much coined the term grit. You want to talk about his team, it's about grit.
Yeah, well, it's funny. That's a kind of a buzzword in Detroit right now, and I think it's a little corny, but it's also true. I mean, these guys they are tough, and I think that the reason that the team has turned it around is for years and years and years. This is really what my book is about. It's about the fact that organizations emanate from the top down, and the culture of the team is sort of established at the top. And for years, William Clay Ford, who my father worked for 10 years, very close personal friend of his, he was a wonderful man, but a terrible football team owner. And the culture was always out of joint under him. His widow, Martha Firestone Ford of the tire fortune, took over after he died and then gave the team to their daughter, Sheila. Well, she created a culture from the first day she came in. She said, we're going to have a culture of, we're going to build a Detroit Lions team, which is why the Dan Campbell hire was so critical. Because, and Chris Spielman, an architect, a great linebacker for the Lions, she brought him in to guide the hiring of the coach and general manager. So the culture is emanating from the top down, and it's going all the way through the organization. And for the first time, really in 60 some years, they got it right. And I think the culture is solid, and that team's going to be good for several years to come. I mean, these are young players. They're drafting. Brad Holmes, the general manager, is a brilliant assessor of talent, and he's drafting wisely. And I think the team is poised for a run kind of like Kansas City's on right now. Okay.
William Clay Ford, he ran the club from 1961 to 2014 before Sheila has come on board and taken things by the scruff of the neck, really. Another person for people to look out for over the next couple of weeks plural, you very much hope, is Jared Goff at quarterback. In the guise of Detroit, I suppose, Rams reject, and he's proved everyone wrong.
Yeah, he did. And, it's funny, when they hired Brad Holmes as general manager and Dan Campbell as coach, neither of them was aware that Matthew Stafford wanted out, that he wanted to be traded. They learned that after they got hired. And to his credit, Brad Holmes, instead of collapsing and saying, oh, my God, my first day on the job, my star quarterback wants to leave. He viewed that not as a crushing bit of bad news, but on the contrary, as an opportunity. And he shopped around and got the best deal he could, which was with Los Angeles. They took Matthew Stafford, gave Jared Goff, a Super Bowl tested quarterback who had had some bad years, and a couple of first-round draft picks and future draft picks. So he wisely got a tested quarterback, gave up a very fine quarterback, but more importantly, got the building blocks to build the foundation of a team that's going to be good for years and years. And that was the key, I think, one of the keys to turning the whole thing around.
The city is just so fascinating. I mean, it's a very famous city, Bill. We all know a lot about Detroit. And you've written about it in your most recent book, and you've written Motor City, and you've written Motor City Burning. So this is a place that you've really tried to grapple with. To work our way backwards for a moment, things are improving, I said cautiously. That's real, is it? That's not people just kind of linking together the team and taking a few scraps and putting together a nice, neat narrative. I was worried I was doing that.
No, I it's complicated, Joe. To go back to your original statement, yes, Detroit, I think, is the most fascinating place I've ever been in my life, and I've traveled a good little bit, and I don't know of any place with a more tortured, fascinating, uplifting, depressing history than the city of Detroit, and it keeps drawing me back. And yes, it is changing right now. There is, since the bankruptcy in 2014, it is on an upswing, but it's very, very complicated. And the rah-rah cheerleaders of downtown Detroit, I think, are in danger of missing something. And that is that the city has deep, deep problems that are going to take years to turn around. There's vast areas that are like prairies. There's nothing there. All the houses and factories are gone. There's pheasants and wolves running around. It's a very strange place. And a lot of people are saying, well, look at Midtown, look at the Detroit Institute of Arts. They saved all that beautiful art. Downtown is booming. Yes, that's all true. And every time I go back, I'm amazed at the changes I see for the better. But a lot of people are upset that a lot of tax dollars went to build these buildings downtown at the expense of libraries, highways, transportation, schools. And so there's a real push-pull going on in Detroit right now. And so to sum it up, I would say, yes, the city, and like the Lions, are very much on the rebound right now, but it's complicated. And the city has deep, deep problems that are going to take years and years to address. But at least something positive is definitely happening in that city right now.
Yeah. Like, to give people a flavor of some of those positives, Michigan Central Station was, the renovation of it was completed last year. The Ford company drove that. It was a $1 billion renovation. So that's a derelict major train station, 18 stories, I think, which is now gleaming, available for businesses and startups, and, you know, a kind of a symbol, I suppose, of that boom in downtown. It's funny when you said prairies about the other areas. I thought for a second that was like some kind of figurative term, but then you said there are literally wolves knocking around. So that is a tale of two cities there.
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's people don't realize who have not been to Detroit. It's a huge city. Within the city limits, south of 8 Mile Road, you know, the iconic M&M 8 Mile Road, there is enough area to hold the city of Boston, San Francisco, and Manhattan Island within the city limits of Detroit. And then the metro area is probably double that. So it's an amazingly huge, flat, low-rise city. It was always primarily single-family homes, many of which are gone. They fell down or got burned and abandoned. And so there's pampas, prairies in the middle of the city, which is an opportunity in one way. There's a lot of urban farming that's happening. You know, it's a fascinating, crazy place, really, when you go there and see it with your eyes. You know, and to think that it was once one of the richest cities on the planet back in the 1920s, the fifth largest city in the United States, and a boom town, really, and packed with people and factories and houses and highways. And now it's almost like a shell, but it's a rebounding shell, I guess you could say.
And I guess when you're talking about the resurgence in the city, it's symbolic more than kind of long-lasting investment. But the draft last year was held in Detroit, and I know you were there, and you know there's a feel-good quality to that event.
Oh, it was feel good, feel great. I mean, it was absolute euphoria. I think 700,000 people came to the city over the course of 3 days. And I was scared of the crowds because in front of the stage, it was like a football field size, people packed shoulder to shoulder. It was kind of scary to me. But the amazing thing was there was no violence, no arrests, no shootings, no nonsense of any kind. It was just a euphoric kind of event. And it was great for the city's self-esteem and worldwide image. I mean, it was a real shining moment for the city of Detroit. And it kind of plays into that narrative we were talking about earlier about the city's rebound and rebirth. And that was symbolic, yeah, but it was also real. I mean, that was a lot of people, and it was a very upbeat, high moment for the city of Detroit and certainly for Lions fans. I mean, they did well in the draft, but yeah, it was a real high for the city of Detroit.
With regard to industry, and you talk about the 20s where things really took off with the Ford company and continued to, a high point in the 50s. Where is the automotive industry now in Detroit? Obviously, it came to the fore in 2008 on the back of the financial crisis and it had to be bailed out and saved. Is it in a healthy state, not so healthy state now?
Well, it's a very Detroit situation. I mean, it's only in Detroit. You've got a inner city core that has been struggling for years and years and years, white flight, people in factories and jobs leaving, surrounded by some of the plushest suburbs in the world. I mean, the amount of wealth in Detroit, in metropolitan Detroit, is staggering. If you drive through these suburbs, they're gorgeous neighborhoods. So yes, people are making a lot of money in Detroit, but they're not making a lot of cars in Detroit. They're making the cars all over the world. But the people who are running the businesses are still there.
Okay.
The white collar people primarily. The blue collar jobs are largely gone. There's a big Dodge factory, Chrysler or Stellantis, I guess now, on the east side. But there used to be 40 factories, and now there's a couple within the city limits. And a lot of them moved out to the suburbs. Of course, they went to the south for non-union, low-wage jobs, and then to Mexico and Canada and China. And so Detroit as a manufacturing center is past. That's gone. That's not coming back. But the city as a driver of the automobile industry is still very much alive. I mean, to call it the Motor City, there's not a lot of motors, but there's a lot of drive in the city that's driving the auto industry, and a lot of wealth. I mean, it's a lot of poverty, a lot of misery, and a lot right alongside staggering wealth. I mean, that's part of the fascination of the city, the class differences. It's not just race, it's class, really. And I tried to get that into my book, because I think I didn't want to write just a football book. I wanted to write a Detroit book, And I tried to get that history, that class divisions, the racial problems, the construction of highways, the covenants that created black ghettos, the discrimination in housing and Motown music and the MC5 and all the good and the bad. I mean, it's just a fascinating stew of a city. And I wanted to get as much of that in there as I could. I hope I didn't overstuff it, but I tried to write. The book is dedicated. I lifted a line from one of my favorite writers, the poet Philip Levine, who's a blue-collar Detroit guy. He served his poetic apprenticeship in the Chevy gear and axle factory, of all places, and became poet laureate of the United States in his later years. And he really had a great line, which I lifted for my dedication. I dedicated the book to the people of Detroit who survive everything America can dish out. And that's from Philip Levine. And that's really what this book is about. It's about the people of Detroit, including Lions fans, but more than that, who've survived everything and continue to survive everything America can dish out.
Yeah. That staggering inequality that you talk about is increasingly a feature of where we are in so many cities. So much wealth and so much poverty, and side by side. Those blue-collar jobs, once upon a time in the factories, and those factories are elsewhere now, have they ever been replaced? Is the blue-collar worker finding employment elsewhere in Detroit?
No, not really. I mean, it's going to have to do like Pittsburgh did. Pittsburgh spun from a steel city to medical, high-tech, education, and Detroit is in the process of doing that right now. And I don't think nobody's going to come back to Detroit and start building factories. I mean, they can get cheaper labor in a lot of different places on the planet, and they don't need to come to Detroit, even though there's a lot of available land that there didn't used to be. But no, I don't see that happening, Joe. I don't think that's in the capitalist playbook. Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, it would be nice if Ford would build a big factory in Detroit and hire 10,000 people like the Rouge, like old Henry built. But that's not going to happen, I don't think.
You mentioned in your book you do deal with the racial politics at play in Detroit. It's approximately 75% black city. So, one of the black cities in America. There was a white flight. I'm not entirely sure when that really reached its zenith, but there was a white flight from the city, and it's been complicated, I suppose. What would you tell us about that aspect?
Well, I tell you, this little sentence I read to you from my friend Bill McGraw, who's a wonderful writer. He's writing a biography right now of Mayor Coleman Young, Detroit's first black mayor, elected in 1974, served 20 years, and he was at the helm when the white flight really bottomed the city out. Right. A lot of people think 1967 there was the rebellion. I call it a rebellion. A lot of people call it a riot. It wasn't a race riot. It was a rebellion against police and real estate and oppression of black people in Detroit. That was 1967, and people say, "Oh, well, after the rebellion of 1967, all the white people ran away." Well, yes, but white people had been leaving Detroit since 1950. The population peaked in 1950. And this is becoming widely documented that Coleman Young didn't chase away all the white people. The city, the federal government, the city government, the regional governments, the auto industry executives, they made the decisions that caused the city to crater and to empty out. When I was a boy, they were building freeways, and you could just drive out to the suburbs and get a big piece of land cheap, and people did it. And sometimes it was to get away from black people, and sometimes it was because they got a better deal. And the black people didn't have that freedom of movement, so white people left, and that really accelerated in the 1970s and 80s. And by the 1990s, when Coleman Young left office, the city had become highly, I think 82% black. And now the white population has actually gone up in the 2020 census for the first time in 50 years. So white people are moving back into the city, but in small numbers. I mean, it's not like a tidal wave like it was when they left back in the day. So, a lot of people in the metropolitan Detroit blame Coleman Young for ruining Detroit. Well, Coleman Young inherited, and when he took office in 1974, that city was on its way down. And he did the best he could to try to stanch the bleeding, but there was very little he could do. And he did the best he could. And I've been reading my friend Bill's biography of him. His title is Mayor Coleman Young and the Twilight of White Detroit, which I think is brilliant because he's really digging into what really happened. It's not a simple story like everything in Detroit. Excuse me. It's not a simple black and white story. It's a very complicated story. It involves, business decisions, real estate, politics, police, highway construction, economic. It's all a big, gigantic ball, and it's going on to this day. It'll go on forever, I'm sure.
Yeah, you mentioned highway construction twice now. Is that just what led to the white flight to the suburbs, or is it more besides?
Well, it certainly greased the skids. I mean, it became so easy for people to get out to the suburbs and into work. My father drove down Southfield Expressway to the Glass House at Ford World Headquarters. It was a quick little drive, on this big fancy highway, and we lived in a nice neighborhood. Well, that was not possible in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Everybody lived in the city, and suddenly there were all these. And to complicate it even further, the Chrysler Expressway on the east side of Detroit, they purposely put it through the thriving black neighborhood called Paradise Valley in the late 1950s. They just erased the thriving black neighborhood on the east side, and they wiped it out. And black people in Detroit to this day are bitter about that.
Right.
And to add a little salt to the wound, it made it that much easier for white people to get out.
So we don't want the disruption of this highway going through a white community or disrupting them, so we'll stick it through the black community.
Exactly. I mean, they pointedly put the highways where the black people were, and the city's full of stories like that. Right. I could go on for hours about. And people of a certain age in Detroit are still bitter about the demolition of Paradise Valley. It was a fabulous. Hastings Street was like, the Black Broadway. It was a jumping part of town, and black people couldn't move anywhere else. There were these racial covenants on real estate, and they were hemmed in and they weren't allowed to move to other neighborhoods. And then they wiped out the neighborhood and they had to scatter to the west side. And that's where the rebellion took place in 1967. An old Jewish neighborhood suddenly, almost overnight, became black because everybody had been pushed out by the Chrysler Freeway. So these are the Detroit stories you get into when you start researching the history of the city.
Okay.
And, the sports is all kind of going along beside that story, but it's a lot of history in that town.
Yeah, very textured when you lay it out in those kind of terms. Going bankrupt as it did in 14, the largest city ever to declare bankruptcy. It's not really a thing that's happened in this part of the world. Cities don't declare bankruptcy, but just in effect, the bills could not be paid. I mean, there was talk of selling off its art to try and generate funds. So that was obviously a huge story at the time. Does that all feel now in the rear view mirror for Detroit, or is there still a lot of acrimony and about that and consequences as a result of that, or has it sort of been dealt with?
Yeah. Actually, I think a little bit of both, Joe. It's funny. Just yesterday, I started reading the book called Grand Bargain, written by Gerald Rosen, who was the mediator in the bankruptcy case. He was a federal judge, and they brought him in to mediate between the creditors and the city and the pensioners and the pension funds and all the people who had debts owed in the city. And he helped work it out. And I talked to a lady who was a lifetime, she still lives in the house she grew up in 7 Mile in Livernois. And she worked for the city for years and years and years. And she said, yes, I had to take a cut in my pension, but at least the city survived. And that, I think, is kind of a fairly prevalent attitude. A lot of people say, oh, well, they saved the art for the white people, and all the black people who spent their lives working for the city took it in the teeth because they took pension cuts. Yes, that's true. But they also voted to approve that. So it's complicated again. It's Detroit, after all. Mm-hmm. And so, they preserved the Detroit Institute of Arts, which was the last jewel left, really. And created a foundation that the city could come back, which it's doing. And so that was I think it's widely regarded as a moment when Detroit, dodged a bullet and got another chance. And I think the city's making the most of it right now. I really do. I think that the comeback is very pronounced and undeniable, really.
Well, that's great. Yeah. So maybe for the first time in a very long time, there's a sense of growth and a sense of optimism in the city. And hey, presto, here come the team. It's really interesting the way that happens.
Yeah, and it's funny. You pointed out that 2008 with the financial crisis and the 0-16 Lions, the parallel in 1957 when they won their last championship. I mean, think of the cars that Detroit was putting out in 1957. I used to drive a 1954 Buick, which I used in my novels that you'd mentioned earlier, Motor City and Motor City Burning. And Detroit was really happening back in 1957, and then. Excuse me, not so much in 2008, and now once again it's happening. It's a roller coaster of a city. It's all, and that's largely because of the nature of the automobile industry. I mean, that's an up and down thing. My father had years when he hardly made anything, and then years when he was flush. It was boom and bust all the time in Detroit. It's a wide open kind of boom and bust town, and that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing one of the booms right now.
Okay, well, hopefully it's on a safer footing. You sounded optimistic there that under the current leadership, the team won't just have a boom year or two; that it might be more prolonged, and hopefully the way investment is being pumped into the city, that continues as well, and it's less boom or busty. But I suppose who knows? Is there a great love for the city amongst its populace? Some people look at their city and they're like, "Oh, this dump," and I could understand if Detroit people might feel that way. And other cities are, we love this place in a very kind of visceral way. We're talking about a lot of people here, so it's hard to generalize. But how would you characterize the relationship between Detroit people and their city?
I think you can generalize. And I think that the answer is that there's a very deep love of the city by the people of Detroit, including people who left like myself and moved away in an adult life and it always pulls you back somehow. And people who've stuck it out, they love the place. There's a bond there, and it's not just the sports; it's the city, it's the spirit of that city. And I think that that's an unkillable thing. And it's you don't see it in a lot of cities. You go to places like Rochester, New York, and Syracuse, New York. I was talking to a kid last night who grew up in Rochester, New York, and he said there was a lot of parallels between the economic hardship that Detroit and Rochester went through. He's working for the city of Detroit now, and he says, but in Detroit, people always loved this place and wanted to make it work. And in Rochester, people just wanted to get the hell out. So there's something there. There is some kind of magic in that city. And it's not just me, it's millions and millions of people feel it. And I very much feel it, but maybe that's me. But I think a lot of people share that. And it's a very unique thing because, like you say, a lot of cities, you won't find that. A lot of people just say, what a dump, let me out of here.
Yeah.
And that's not the case in Detroit. Yes, a lot of people left. And yes, the city went all the way to the bottom. But the people who hung on and the people who are still in touch with the city, like myself, have a very deep bond with the place. And it's hard to explain. You kind of have to go there to understand it. And it's a very special place.
Yeah. How would you try and explain it if you had to? What is it when that city calls you, or when you go there, or when you think about it? What's conjured up?
I guess it's that thing we were talking about a minute ago. All the contradictions, the class, the race, the history, the boom, the bust, the wealth, the poverty, the violence, the peace, the love. I mean, the music alone it's always been a mecca for popular music, and all those things are woven into this fabric of this city. And of course, cars. I mean, Americans and cars
Sure.
are, it's a marriage made in heaven, right? And so there's that. I mean, there's this automobile thing in the genes and gasoline in the veins, and that's something that it's a very unique thing in America. And the Motor City that's exactly what it is. It's the Motor City.
So if the Lions, and Lions kind of an appropriate moniker for the team, isn't it? That kind of fight and aggression. If they go and do this, listening to the way you've talked about the last 50, 60 years, that mania is going to be off the charts. This will be one of the greatest Super Bowl celebrations of all time.
Oh, I hate to think, and there was a story in the Free Press this morning about, if they don't win the Super Bowl, will the season be a failure? And that's the level people are at right now. We got to do this, and everything I read, everybody says that they're the favorites. They're the best team out there. So if they win it, I think that city is going to erupt in a nice way. I mean, in years past, they've had some violence after World Series wins and so forth, but I don't see that happening. I think it's just going to be pure, unbridled joy if they pull this off.
Yeah. Do you suspect much of America would like to see it for Detroit? Does it have that place in America's heart?
I really do. I think that Americans all over the country are it's not just the people of Detroit and the Detroit Lions fans. I think I hear it from people all over the country. I hear it in New York. People saying, I'd really like to see those guys. They've earned this. They deserve it. The people of Detroit, they finally can, they have a reason to be happy. And, it's just a football game. But I was at a reading down in North Carolina a couple of weeks ago, and a guy there was saying, I grew up in a coal town in West Virginia, and it was a kind of depressed area, but we were Pittsburgh Steelers fans. And he said, when the Steelers won, everybody in that town was lifted up. Everybody was happy. He says, we didn't have better cars. We didn't make more money. We didn't get a better job. We didn't get a prettier wife, but we were lifted up by this football team. And I think that's definitely happening in Detroit. And I think the sentiment is shared really widely across the country. I really do. I think that the misery, the history and the misery of the Detroit Lions has got football fans all over the world, really, saying, "Boy, I hope these guys pull this off, because they really have earned it. They deserve it."
So I guess to the present day football, the team have probably played the most eye-catching football and been super impressive, and yet Kansas is sort of there like this impenetrable rock, knockout football, try and stop us. And that must, that's kind of a scary prospect. How good is this Lions team? And we know what your heart wants. What does your head say about their chances?
Well, I'm not a real great football mind. I mean, I've watched the game all my life, but I don't really understand it deeply the way some of these people do. And I talk to, sports writers in Detroit, guys who've covered the team for years, who really know their stuff. And, everybody who really knows the game tells me that this is clearly the best team out there, top to bottom. They have no holes, even though they've had a ton of injuries, especially on defense. They figure out ways to keep winning, and that to me is pretty impressive. I mean, that's again going back to what we were talking about earlier, the cultural thing. If there's a culture that people are going to step in when somebody goes down, that's very much a part that grit word that we used earlier. That's what you're seeing right now with this team, and so people who really understand the game are pretty unanimous in saying that this is the best team out there. I mean, I look at Philadelphia and Baltimore and Kansas City and Buffalo. I mean, those are great teams too. So anything could happen, but I sure would like to see these guys pull this off.
You'd have to hightail it from New York to Detroit, I think, if they do.
Yeah, I might have to do that.
Bill, really fascinating to talk to you and get your perspective. I'm sure people will be very interested in the book now, having heard you. It's called The Lions Finally Roared: The Ford Family, the Detroit Lions, and the Road to Redemption in the NFL. I'm sure people can order that online, no trouble. Bill Morris, thanks so much, Bill. Nice to talk to you.
Joe, thank you. Appreciate it.
So that's Bill Morris, author of The Lions Finally Roar. And Bill has told us if the Lions win the Super Bowl, he's coming back on the show. And that's a deal we're happy to make. They play Washington this weekend, and beyond that, we'll see.